Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. My name is Colleen Theron. I am a tri-qualified lawyer and the founder of Ardea International, and I'm really delighted to be hosting this webinar today. This is the third webinar in our series on respecting human rights, and I'm delighted to be joined by expert speakers Chris Kipp, Conera Moore, Jordi Lasafer and Nadia Hawara. I've got it wrong already. I'm going to let you do this, even though I practiced and got it wrong right in the beginning. So I am going to allow each speaker to introduce themselves personally, particularly if you have difficult surnames and I get it wrong. So just a few housekeeping points, please. The webinar will be recorded and the session and access to the recording will be available afterwards on our website. We are going to endeavour to answer your questions in the session today. If you can, please raise your questions in the question and answer box. And I see that there are many more participants joining us. For those of you who are joining us now, welcome. So these are our speakers, and as I said, they are going to introduce themselves today. We've got such a great roundup, and I'm sure that you're going to find our conversation really insightful. Just very briefly, something about Ardea International. We are a specialist sustainability, business and human rights consultancy with expertise in modern slavery. We've been running for about 11 years, and we work with business to help them address legal compliance issues and develop best practice procedures. We do a lot of training, and we work internationally across organizations and different businesses. So for my part today, I'm not going to say a lot. I just want to highlight a few sort of 4 very high level points that I've seen perhaps as critical issues around this challenge of addressing child labour in business and supply chains. And really, I'm going to then hand over to our expert speakers who've got a lot to share in this area. I think for a lot of you who are listening today that our webinar, I think, is both auspicious and sedacious, and I think sagacious is even the word. And the reason I say that is because of the release of the ILO and the UNICEF report that was released this morning. And you'll see that the estimates of child labour have increased from 152 million to 160 million, of which 79 million are children performing hazardous tasks. And I know that Chris is certainly going to be reflecting on this in his part of the presentation. But I think from my perspective, I find that quite concerning. And I really wonder how business is going to rise to this challenge and how they're going to address the issues that have been raised in this report, and particularly the increase in the numbers. So going back to my point about, I think, some of the things that can be thought about and should be thought about in addressing child labour issues is first of all getting the concepts and the definitions right. I see often that there's confusion around what child rights are, what child labour is, what is forced labour. So really getting to grips with what these particular definitions are is one of the key mechanisms of how you're actually going to then go forward and address the issues. I think it's critical to identify the prevalence of child labour in your supply chain, to know the root causes and to consider your remediation strategies. The second point I wanted to raise is that relating to international laws and standards. Now, we've certainly seen a progression and growth in the legislation around due diligence and addressing human rights impacts as well as environmental impacts. But, you know, for many organizations, they still probably don't have a proper understanding of the ILO conventions, its recommendations, and also the voluntary frameworks that have been set up, like the UNGPs, to address how businesses should identify their human rights issues, and that includes child labour, and then how they would mitigate the risk around that. And we're also, of course, seeing a rise in domestic legislation concerning child labour issues. And I think there's some interesting legislation that's coming out, particularly in Europe, which is going to require businesses to consider their due diligence strategy, as well as the action plans that they have to put in place to address child labour issues. Next point I wanted to make concerns increased legal liability. So we're seeing increased civil liability actions that are being taken. These are ones that actually are around the chocolate industry. One case against Nestle has been running since 2005. It's still not seen completion. They think that there should be a judgment this year. A recent class action was filed last year against Mars and Nestle. And this is for alleged complicity in trafficking of ape lions and forced labor issues. The other issue around liability is it relates really to the enforcement of import bans or withhold to release orders. So we're seeing a lot of that now in the US. The example that we've highlighted here is relates to British American Tobacco, where when a letter before action was raised in the UK against BAT for alleged crimes of or alleged child labour in Malawi for tobacco, the US issued a withhold to release order stopping any import of tobacco products from Malawi. And from other cases around withhold to release orders, there is a real penalty for businesses if that happens because of the operational flows, the reputational impact, and also the financial impact of these things happening. And lastly, just some very high level points for business to consider around mitigating liability. I think it's really critical that you assess the actual and potential risk of child labour in your organisation supply chains. Go on to identify your gaps in your governance structures, your policies, your due diligence processes. There is a need to understand corporate leverage and the responsibility that businesses have in addressing child labour issues. Capacity building is really critical. Developing a remediation procedure and protocol is also critical. And then finally, how one monitors and implements your due diligence strategy and then reviews and reports on these. So that sounds really easy. I completely get it doesn't happen like that. It is very often a journey. It is a marathon. It is not a sprint. But perhaps if you're starting to think about it, these are just, 6 points that can set you on that journey. So that's enough said from me today. And I'm now going to hand over to Chris. So Chris, over to you. And I believe you're not using slides this morning.
Yes, that's true. Thanks so much, Colleen, for that comprehensive introduction, and also, of course, for inviting me to the webinar. My name is Chris, as Colleen has said. I'm with UNICEF. I support our work on child rights and global supply chains. And as Colleen has mentioned, it's, of course, an extremely timely webinar today, as UNICEF and ILO have together, for the first time together, released the new global child labor estimates. And Colleen has mentioned it, for the first time in 2 decades now, we actually see progress stalled, and we see a rise in absolute child labor numbers by about 8 million to 160 million. And that actually constitutes about 1 in 10 children worldwide that are engaged in child labor. So really, really concerning numbers. The fact that progress has not continued. We have made progress until around 2016 or a bit later. But also, of course, the fact that not just that, it's also that numbers have gone up, at least in absolute terms. And many have already asked the question when UNICEF and ILO came out with a statement and the report today, is that because of COVID? And it's important to recognize that actually the deteriorating trend started pre-COVID. So the numbers reflect a trend that happened before COVID, where children are in a high number of children engaged in child labor. And now, because of COVID, there's an additional risk that millions of more children may end up in child labor without the adequate mitigation measures in the coming years. So meaning that when we now talk about 160 million for 2020, it's very possible, perhaps even likely, that that number will even go up unless governments and businesses and other stakeholders put in place the right mitigation measures. Now, I won't go into much detail about the report. I think we don't have that much time for that here. But just to mention, there are some important geographic differences. So it's really, especially sub-Saharan Africa, which has the largest share of child labor. Particularly, of course, this is not surprising, in agriculture. I think about 70% of child labor occurs in agriculture, and predominantly, obviously in rural areas, but also in the context of family work. Although the trend is alarming, there is some progress in some regions, and it's useful to look at those differences. For anyone who wants to know more, I mean, the report is out today, but there's also, right after this webinar, actually a high-level event by UNICEF and the ILO at 2:30 Central European time. So perhaps we can share the link. It's with Guy Ryder, the Director General of the ILO, and the Executive Director of UNICEF. It's a 90-minute briefing, I think, on the report, on the findings, on the reasons for the higher numbers, and of course also key recommendations going forward. Now, we already knew before today that there was a huge risk of child labor numbers going up because of COVID. So last year, there was an ILO UNICEF report that really warned of that trend, and main reasons being really around falling living standards, which, you know, in many parts of the world, because of the socioeconomic consequences of COVID, of course, deteriorating employment opportunities, which lead to reduced income, rising informality, disrupted education. Of course, we know that one of the key reasons children being engaged with work is lack of access to quality education, but also pressure on public budgets, international aid, and international trade flows. So really, some important reasons here that give an insight into why those numbers are going up, and those factors, especially in the context of the absence of comprehensive social protection, coverage for hundreds of millions of families globally, really means that risk of rising child labor will continue. So this is really something also, I think, important for businesses to keep in mind. And why is it important that I mention these aspects? I mean, for us, really, it's, of course, child labor is inextricably linked to these broader socioeconomic vulnerabilities of working parents, of families, of children. And that's really, I think, an important point. Child labor is both a cause, but it's also a consequence of poverty, of social exclusion, of lack of access to quality education, etc., and so forth. So when we talk about child labor in global supply chains, from our vantage point, at least, we really need to think about the situation of children in global supply chains, and to what extent these children have access to basic social services, health, education, their families enjoy a decent standard of living, and they have access to quality education, and they're protected in times of crisis and hardship. So the first key message from my side I'd like to leave with you is that it's very important to consider child labor in the broader context of child rights and child rights deprivations. So that means, for us at least, when we talk about child labor in global supply chains, we need to think about children's rights in global supply chains. Now, what does that mean for business? Of course, you know, business, I mean, governments play a key role when it comes to access to quality education, social protection, health, etc. Absolutely. But we also know, and Colleen has alluded to that, of course, there are existing standards that require companies to ensure respect for children's rights, and ideally also support for children's rights. So the UNGPs, of course, which require companies to act with due diligence to ensure respect for all human rights, including children's rights, so the rights of some of the most vulnerable stakeholders, but also all children's rights, not just child labor. So specifically also, you might be familiar with the Children's Rights and Business Principles, which were released in 2012, actually, and have their 10-year anniversary next year, which really are based on the UNGPs and call on companies to act with child rights due diligence, or perhaps better put, to ask companies to integrate child rights into their human rights due diligence, to specifically respect and whenever they can, ideally also support children's rights in the workplace, in the marketplace, and in the community. And the reason we think it provides a useful framework also in the context of this discussion is because they make the connection between different rights. So the right to the freedom from child labor, decent work for parents and caregivers, businesses addressing adverse environmental and community impacts, really realizing their interlinkages. And that's really important if we want to, as businesses, as governments, as stakeholders, address the drivers of child labor and not just fight the symptoms. So that really leads me in a way to the second key point from my side, which is really about the importance, again, at least in our experience, for businesses to move away from a sort of reactive approach, which focuses on monitoring, on compliance, on auditing, exclusive focus on remedy, towards a much more prevention-focused approach. And that is really, I mean, it sounds simple, but it's really about actions which ensure child labor doesn't occur in the first place. And this might sound logical and obvious, but the reality is, from what we observe, many companies still heavily invest in the monitoring, compliance, and auditing piece, but do not invest in the prevention piece. And that's really critical. And I am happy to give a few examples, maybe how this could look like. So for businesses, for example, in the first instance, of course, it's about analyzing and reviewing how they themselves, through their own practices, might contribute to the root causes of child labor. So one is purchasing practices. It's a huge challenge in global supply chain still in terms of business practices, that the impact that purchasing practices can have on the ability of suppliers, of business partners, to meet basic labor standards. So for example, making sure that businesses do not contribute to economic pressure or undue economic pressure on business partners, on volatility, on uncertainties for suppliers. So downward pressure on prices, production costs, short turnaround times, sudden increases in order volumes. We know it's very well documented how those practices can increase labor rights risks, including child labor. There's many industries where it's very well documented how irresponsible purchasing practices contribute to labor rights abuses. So that's a point for companies also to start in relation to child labor and look at, through their core business practices in their own supply chain, how do they actually support suppliers in meeting basic human rights and labor standards. The second one, and again, that's perhaps something that's absolutely not new, is really about integrating decent work, fair wages here, particularly important also in the context of child labor. So living wages, there's a big argument in the report that came out today about the importance about decent work for parents and caregivers, and the importance of living wages, which we know play a critical role in preventing or in addressing the root causes of child labor. So really to integrate that and sort of prevention-focused child labor approaches in businesses' own supplier codes of conduct, in their monitoring approaches, in their capacity building activities with suppliers. So Colleen mentioned that in the previous slide, some very important aspects there around the capacity building work, but still, when it comes to child labor, often the capacity building is not about addressing the vulnerabilities or the root causes. It's much more about, again, audits and compliance to fight the symptoms. And we need to take these figures today as a warning sign that the conventional approach has severe limitations, and we need more investment to address the root causes, including by ensuring decent work, again, for adult workers, for families, so that families are better off and can escape poverty. Businesses, of course, already do, and they can play a very big role in advocating and supporting holistic child rights approaches to child labor prevention in legal and regulatory frameworks. So, of course, there's major shortcomings in host countries in terms of child labor, enforcement of child labor legislation, and even in the design of some of that. But businesses can use their voice and their advocacy to also say, they're in favor of strong laws, of enforcement of strong laws, and to really sort of that notion around prevention also have that embedded in the legal frameworks. And very importantly, and maybe also back to Colleen, what you said, the same for those regulatory frameworks that are currently being developed in home countries, if you will. So the developments at the EU level, of course, but also in EU member states. Germany, just yesterday, the relevant committee agreed that the draft supply chain law will be put to a vote on Friday to Parliament, and it's very likely that this law will be approved. Which is great news. I mean, it has certainly its limitations, but when you look at the child labor provisions in there, they're very basic in a way, and they're very much it's a missed opportunity to have that broader child rights approach to child labor prevention also in those legal frameworks. So we hope that over time, there's better recognition and awareness among policymakers about the importance of children's rights and addressing children's rights in order to prevent child labor. So again, that piece, particularly for this webinar, may be around the legal and regulatory framework, both at the home and at the host country. I think there's a lot of work that we all need to do together to make sure they are properly designed. Of course, businesses have a big role to play in the community through their suppliers, through their voice, and many companies have sort of programs in place that already address issues around community empowerment and also social harmful social norms. So again, there's a big opportunity here to design them also in a way that are gender sensitive, so address the different vulnerabilities of boys and girls to child labor, that look at children at particular risk, of course, in the informal sector, and also make that link to access to quality education. So here, perhaps more opportunities to support. So going beyond that notion of avoiding being implicated in child labor to actually doing something proactive to prevent child labor from happening in the future. And then the last thing I'll say, and I think I'll stop there to not take too much time. A key message from us is also around the importance that businesses need to ensure that they support and complement existing national programs and development efforts. So we see a lot of sort of private systems of compliance, audits, and monitoring and certification, which sometimes link to national system, which is very important. And I think a lot of progress has been made in the past, but sometimes not. And it's really important to strengthen those local labor inspection systems, the national child protection systems, the local governance and government structure, so that businesses, rather than setting up their own systems, really look at who are the stakeholders we can work with locally, nationally, and particularly around the government to help them strengthen their systems, which is of course much more sustainable than creating their own. And I think that goes to the point that you mentioned, Colleen, around corporate leverage. No business alone can do that. No business alone should it's not their responsibility to make sure that labor inspections work, but together with stakeholders, businesses can play a key role to support local government systems. So a few areas that I mentioned here. I think I'll stop here with those sort of key messages, and really looking forward to the rest of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That's really insightful. Having just had a flick through the report, I'm really pleased the different aspects that you highlighted. I think they're really useful, and I think if people have got questions, we'll come back to those later on. So, Kanira, if I may please hand over to you, and for your
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes, so thank you, Colleen, for having me on this webinar. Really interesting to hear from Chris. So I will build on what Chris has just spoken about and talk more about the steps that businesses can take to tackle child labor, and indeed, where possible, so the wider children's rights issues in their supply chains and the communities and countries where they source from and work in. And indeed, now more than ever, companies with these new numbers coming in should be really encouraged to take action and have positive impact on children, because that is, of course, possible. So also building on Colleen's slide earlier on the steps businesses can take, I will discuss this in a bit more detail, what steps businesses can take, what systems to use, and what different partnerships there are at which level. So yes, please, can you go to the next slide, Colleen? So here you see, and it was already mentioned by Colleen and also by Chris, the guiding principles on business and human rights, the children's rights and business principles, and you can apply the guiding principles very much to child labor. So I've here outlined the kind of steps that businesses can take to tackle child labor, and of course, as also mentioned by both Chris and Colleen, so I won't be too repetitive. It really starts with a commitment, right, at the company level to, and now again more than ever, to really renew your efforts on tackling child labor, to understand what the issues are, where you source from, where you work, and make a commitment in your policies, in the way you work with your suppliers to tackle this issue. And then with that commitment, of course, have investments into that. The next steps would be, and again, I mean, like Colleen said, have a good map of your supply chain. Who do you work with and where? What are the risks in those different parts of your supply chain? And a lot of data is available already. There are lots of indices on child labor. There's indices on the children's rights and business principles that Chris just mentioned. We've just produced a child labor and forced labor risk map for the 4 products at Rainforest Alliance, the key sourcing products. There is a lot of information out there. So having that overview of where your risks are, prioritizing what you can do based on your leverage, but also based on the collaboration you can start with other actors in your sector. Because together, of course, as Chris has also mentioned, and big part, of course, of Rainforest Alliance is working in alliance to tackle these issues and improve the situation. From your assessment and your overview of where your risks are higher, and you can then decide to take action, the right action for the right locations. I will discuss this more in detail, but of course, again, you have different levels of actions together with your suppliers in terms of training and inputs, or increased human rights due diligence and monitoring, as Chris was saying, and actions indeed by funding programs, etc. I will discuss that in the next slide. Then the next steps we come to then is to monitor how well your action is working, to really understand, how is the situation changing? How effective is my system? And as Chris said, a lot of focus has been on this monitoring and not enough on the prevention. But I do still think it's really important that we continue to look at how well what we do is working, and does it have the impact we want to have. And as we see, in Southern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, the child labor is growing. And the most worrying trend I find is that it's growing, especially with the youngest children between 5 and 11, right? So, but for children aged 12 and up, it's decreasing. But these youngest children, so it's really important that action there is taken. Access to education, etc. Anyway, sorry, back to monitoring. So knowing what is happening in your supply chain, where the risks are high, to make sure that your steps are the right steps, and if they're not working, you can make adaptations and invest more, do more training, start other collaborations. And I think then, of course, when you identify cases, or when you suppliers through your systems identify cases, then there's a need to remediate those cases, to stop the harm, remove those children from child labor, and support families, children, to either go back to school, raise their income, etc. So this is a really important step. There's a level of responsibility for businesses as outlined in the guiding principles in business and human rights, to remediate identified cases. And then last but definitely not least is the reporting and the transparency on child labor, on what you do, on the cases you find. And then I would say both internally and externally. And we see the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs have got a special fund for businesses to tackle child labor. And recently, through interviews, they found out that many companies report more engagement from their staff, knowing that they invest in efforts to tackle child labor. People are proud to work for an organization that is really looking at tackling those root causes and working in partnership, helping children go back to school. So both internally, but also externally, to show that we are transparent about this, and to also encourage your suppliers to be transparent about this. Because unfortunately, we do still see suppliers who do report cases of child labor to then lose buyers, etc. So we need to make sure that transparency does not lead to cutting off supply chains, but really leads to further collaboration, where, of course, the suppliers are also willing to invest in tackling this issue. Next slide, please, Colleen. Just also, as you saw in the middle, I put collaborate, and I think it's, like Chris also said, none of us can do this alone. Look at your leverage, look at the leverage of other companies, partner with them, partner with the sectors. There's so many initiatives out there in many different sectors. Of course, cocoa is one. In coffee, we see more collaboration, and there's lots in fruit networks, etc. So do it together, work together within your sector, but also with civil society, donors, and governments in the countries where you source from. Right, so going more in detail on that act, integrate piece. So what steps can you take? So indeed, having a very clear overview of where your risks are to really, that helps often with internal messaging. Also, we have to invest in these countries because there is a big risk and there are the different consequences associated with that, as Colleen showed, the legal cases, etc. So that's the first level, to really have a clear overview where your risks are and what you need to do in which locations. And then the kind of first steps that we see many companies take, the first kind of level of action, is supporting human rights due diligence systems in your supply chain. As Chris was saying, there's a lot of focus on child labor and monitoring and remediation systems, which really focuses on monitoring incidents of child labor and remediating that, or certification, which is a way to improve the standard of living, and often also of production and of human rights and environment in your supply chain. And more and more, and especially also for the Rainforest Alliance, I can mention that for us, our system is risk-based. So our certificate holders, our farmers, have to conduct a risk assessment. And based on those risk assessment, they have to take action to mitigate these risks. So human rights due diligence is indeed mostly looking at monitoring and remediation, but also increasingly at identifying those risks at local level and preventing them from becoming actual cases. Then the next level of programs that companies can be engaged in, and what we also see, is really closer collaboration with supply chain and investment in supply chain sustainability programs. So that could be training on child labor, to create that awareness on what is allowed, what's not allowed. And as Chris was saying, there's still a lot of harmful practices also in terms of girls not going into school, or people thinking it's fine that children aged 10 carry heavy loads, etc. So really tackling the harmful local practices, but also working to tackle some of those root causes within your own supply chain. So that can be increasing the income, improving the workers' income, but also their wages, access to health programs, and also, where possible, looking at specific issues for children, access to education, and where there are young children working, making sure that that work is safe, and making sure there's opportunities, and again, focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, opportunities for rural youth for decent employment as an alternative to child labor. So this is really focusing on your supply chain, and whilst that will definitely decrease the risk of child labor and improve the livelihoods of people within your supply chain, it won't really do so much at the whole root cause level and the community and landscape level. And so where we really see through our programs, and also many other organizations have worked on this, for instance, child labor free zones, working closely with local governments, with community members, with local NGOs and businesses on tackling those root causes, is the most sustainable way of tackling this issue. And what we have seen through programs is that both for local governments as well as for businesses, they're not often used to work on a complex topic like child labor together. So where there's an increased understanding of what companies can bring in terms of increasing income, supporting monitoring systems, supporting remediation, setting up programs that improve the situation of women, the income of women, has often led also to governments then investing more in, for instance, education systems. So we really see that at that root cause level and landscape and community programs, that the most sustainable impact can be made. And again, want to really stress here that the partnership model is really key. So those are the kind of different levels of engagement and investment. Colleen, do you mind going to the next slide, please? So what are the different kind of partnerships? I won't go into detail, but you see here on the different levels, the actions you can, for instance, take with your supply chain partners within your sector, having better agreements, and we see it quite a lot on for instance, living wage. The German, the Dutch sector working really much on, for instance, the banana on living wage commitments. With civil society working on, income generating programs, training, awareness raising, child protection systems, child labor free zones, education. And then indeed with governments, as Chris already mentioned, both in the kind of consumer countries, in sourcing countries, working on laws and policies that improve the situation of children in those countries, the investments towards better access to quality education, income protections, social protection, healthcare, etc. But also indeed for a level playing field to mandatory human rights due diligence in key kind of consumer countries. Next slide, please. Yes, I just want to mention some examples of corporate actions to tackle child labor. So the coalition of ICI, it's an initiative where many cocoa companies come together to tackle child labor together with so the local cocoa cooperatives. They also share a lot of data on the kind of root causes of child labor and what works and what doesn't work. Then what I mentioned before, this Dutch government funding for businesses to tackle child labor in their supply chain. They have put together quite a few reports on what works and doesn't work, and more is forthcoming. And then of course the Alliance 8.7, where all of us come together to make our pledges, to learn together, and especially in this year, towards the eradication of child labor. I think it's really key that as many businesses as possible join this network and pledge publicly to tackle the issue of child labor. That's it for me for now, Colleen. And yeah, any questions at the end, please? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kanera. That was really insightful. I've got my own questions. I just hope we're going to have enough time to get into them. Just quickly before we introduce Nadia, I wonder, Chris, would you mind in the question and answer chat just putting a link in for Roxy on the ILO report if you've got it to hand? I think that's what she's asking for. So Nadia, if I can welcome you and hand over to you. Thank you very much. And if you can pronounce your surname for us, that would be helpful. Thanks.
It's always an icebreaker, my name, my entire life. Thank you, Colleen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all. So I'm Nadia with the very difficult last name, Waro Mwaura. And today I'm happy to share with you a little bit about JDE's due diligence approach on how we tackle and address child labor in our supply chain. So if we go to the first slide, Colleen, or the next one actually. Thank you. So Jacobstouwer Egberts, many of you might not know who we are, or JDE is a global coffee and tea company with multiple brands in over 140 countries. And they're probably brands that you're aware of and wouldn't have known are behind JDE. And our corporate responsibility strategy is based on our purpose of unleashing the possibilities of coffee and tea to create a better future. That's a mouthful, but basically the core element of our strategy when it comes to our sourcing is responsible sourcing. And here we are talking about addressing priority issues in the supply chain. And no wonder this topic is important because, you know, in coffee, we've seen reports, we know about issues of labor issues in the supply chain, and that is very important for our supply chain and our commitments. So we have two public commitments with specifically on this topic today. One is about 100% responsibly sourced coffee by 2025, and we're well on our way towards that, as well as directly positively reaching over 500,000 smallholder coffee and tea farmers by 2025. If you look a little bit deeper at our kind of responsible sourcing strategy and the work that we're doing on the right, there's a little table there. That's the framework we use. And we have 3 pillars, which you might recognize traditionally as people, planet, profit. You know, we, through the many years of working in various supply chains across coffee and tea in the world, we have identified the most critical issues to be addressed as, on the one hand, you know, the planet aspect, which is sustainability of land, where all of our work and investments are around building resilience towards climate change and improving soil and health and water. And this too touches on this topic of today, you know, the resilience to climate, the intermittent weather patterns, you know, floods and all the stuff that's happening has an impact on households and lives, and how we can address these and proactively also address some of these things, to Chris's point earlier on. The second pillar is about people in the supply chain, the farmers and the workers that produce the coffee and the tea that we love to drink every day. Here we look at 3 kind of themes, focus areas: gender and youth, often very closely linked to the topic of child labor. How can we make sure that there is inclusivity of women and youth in trainings and economic opportunities? So while the report we were referring to earlier on is seeing a dramatic rise of the 5 to 11-year-olds, we're also seeing in some of the work we're doing on the ground where youth are increasingly, you know, involved or want to get economically involved to support, you know, the families or do meaningful work. But how can we take them along that journey in a way that is not harmful for their own lives or opportunities? We also look at human rights issues through the lens of international standards and conventions that have been mentioned before, both in child labor and working conditions in both coffee and tea. And then the last pillar is the economic pillar, which is critical. For us, where coffee is part of our DNA, it is important that coffee farming continues to be economically viable for the farmers, for this and the next generation. And this is really about training and capacity building on farm management, you know, financial literacy, business skills, increasing productivity and quality and access to market, all with the objective of increasing available income at the household level. And we know when there's more available income at a household level, many of the issues that we're tackling and addressing hopefully will be unlocked. In another key part of that is, so I keep on talking about coffee, but we're well aware that, you know, coffee may be a main source of income for many of these families. In many countries, in most countries, coffee is a one harvest crop. So how do we support those farming households to diversify their income across the year so that they can reduce their own economic vulnerabilities and not just wait for that one harvest to come and be able to reap the rewards of their coffee plantation? The next slide, please, Colleen. So here in a nutshell, it's really difficult to put it. I think, Kunera, you did a really good job of putting the points across of the due diligence process. And here, if I talk about, you know, in very simple bullet numbers, our due diligence process, it's embedded into our responsible sourcing strategy. And the program and this process that we have developed, we have actually developed together in partnership with Rainforest Alliance, with a strong focus on continuous improvement, looking at all social, economic, and environmental conditions in the origins where the coffee and tea is grown. And here I do stress on continuous improvement, because there is no black or white. There's no, now it's all good, let's move on to the next. It's really an ongoing process of you know, multi-year investments, this proactive approach to address issues before they even arise, or then address those that you're aware of. And it's all about, as I've been saying, and everyone else has been saying, protecting vulnerable people, improving livelihoods of farmers, and supporting farming that is friendly for the planet and for the people for now and for the future. So in summary, if I look at the 4 steps that might be difficult to look at in the chart over there, we start our due diligence process by first engaging our suppliers. How do we do that? It's a robust self-assessment process to define what's the understanding or the alignment of our suppliers, our supply chain, to our own sourcing principles, to identify the risks in the supply chain, and also to identify what actions, mitigation strategies need to be taken to address these risks. And I stress here on the importance of this step because the people that know the supply chain the best are those that have boots on the ground, that are on the ground buying, selling that coffee, in our case, on a day-to-day basis. So it's that value chain from the farmer to when that product comes into your brand or your cup of tea there. And there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of understanding, there's a lot of vertical integration, there's a lot of local knowledge that is very valuable to build into this due diligence and understanding. The next step we do is through the partnership with Rainforest Alliance. You see some examples there on the right of the screen. We have Rainforest Alliance conduct these independent assessments at a country level. These assessments are based on various aspects of national, local legislature, on all of the criteria we're looking at, whether it's labor, whether it's environmental criteria, business practices. And so Rainforest Alliance looks at the legislative piece, public evidence. So again, as was mentioned, there's so much research, so much information that's out there. And these origin issue assessments are compiled, and we have all of this evidence for a specific country put together. And then also, when needed, expert opinions. So are there people out there that are working specifically in some area, local or international? How do we include these expert opinions, experiences into this valuable kind of report? These are available on our website, and you can have a look at them. And these reports give us a kind of scorecard, a kind of warning system of what are the highest risks are in our supply chain and where we should be looking towards taking action. And then the next step is step 3, but between 2 and 3, there's a lot of work that goes into a full-blown country risk assessment. You know, if needed, we will commission additional field studies, conduct a baseline, interviews, and all kinds of things, all leading to the design and setting up of improvement projects. Today we have around 40 of these running in 18 of our key coffee and tea origins. The key here, as I've mentioned before, is continuous improvement and partnering with the farming communities, suppliers, service providers, NGOs, and very important, the local governments. It has to be a bottom-up approach to be able to understand the specific needs of that community that you're looking at. And then lastly, in the very middle, we've also talked about it, is the constant monitoring, evaluation, and learning to adapt, improve, reinvest, and repeat again. And whether that is, again, to Kunera's point, is it about sharing external learnings and with the industry, with other like-minded people, or internally also? What have we learned through these processes? How can we train our own procurement staff? How can we train our own associates, employees to identify risks, to know what to look for? What are those watch out signs when we're in a procurement process or understanding a new supply chain? So those are the learnings that we get from the ground that we then also replicate internally. And then, conscious of time, I'm going to go to my last slide, Colleen. And this one is a loaded one, and I could spend hours on this, but I just wanted to give you some examples of what we are doing currently, these are active projects on the ground to address child labor in our supply chain. So on the very left is a project in Honduras. We're partnering there with World Vision and the Honduran Coffee Exporter Association. We're in a second phase of this project. This project started really small and out of a real necessity. Basically, the reality is during the coffee harvest season, the same problem presents itself. Mothers and fathers take their children to the farms to pick the coffee as they have no other alternative. You're better off taking your child with you to the field than leaving your child alone at home because there's no access to quality education or childcare. So this project is building, it focuses on building and developing childcare and development centers, giving the parents a safe and reliable place to leave their children. You know, and there they have access to warm meals, quality education, to be able to also, you know, improve their own life opportunities. This project is built on learnings of World Vision's Bright Futures project, which was funded by the US Department of Labor, and works very closely with the Honduran government and the Ministry of Education. So it's something that we believe can continue well beyond the project life cycle. The second one is a project we're also running at the moment in Uganda, partnering with Rainforest Alliance, and Kunera also mentioned the Dutch Enterprise organization, which is an arm of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a local supplier, as well as the Teachers Union. Here it's a community-based approach, you know, improving coffee farmers and coffee families' access to training to improve their productivity and their incomes, but then also to improve the access to quality education and child protection mechanisms in the field. There's also one we've just launched in Vietnam, also again partnering with the Dutch Enterprise Agency and Rainforest Alliance and local suppliers. This one is slightly different because here we're tackling child labor, the risks of child labor amongst indigenous communities. And here we're seeing indigenous communities are at risk because of various reasons. The language is different, their access to education is different, their cultural norms. And here again, through coffee, through training, through productivity, through sensitization, child protection, we're trying to raise awareness and address the issue. Lastly, Kip, you're here, you're from UNICEF. This is a project we're also pretty proud of. We're partnering with UNICEF in India, in Assam, with the Ethical Tea Partnership and other tea companies. And this is a massive project where the industry has come together. It's a really great one with tea companies. And we're using a rights-based approach in Assam. It's multifaceted. It includes health, nutrition, child protection, wash, education, and working with the state of Assam and businesses and plantations to address these issues. That was my last slide. I know time is of the essence, but happy to share more for anybody who's interested. Now maybe I just stop with one last thing. I think it's been said. The learning is we all need to work together on this. It's a very complex issue. You need the right infrastructure, you need the right mindset. There's no right way to do it. We just need to act now.
Thank you, Nadia. I'm so sorry, we're running out of time, so I'd really like to give Geordie a chance to speak. I don't know, Geordie, if you're able to sort of condense what you're saying, perhaps, 5-8 minutes, and if everyone is still able to stay, perhaps we can just see how long you take and allow a minute or two for questions. So thank you. I know that this was always going to be tight with so many speakers. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Colleen. I'll try to be a bit quicker. So good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be with you. I'm product manager of V.E.'s controversy risk assessment product. V.E. is a provider of ESG-related data. And as a rating agency, we evaluate companies' integration of social, environmental, and governance factors into their strategy, operations, and management. These data are then used by investors in their investment decisions. And V.E. is now an affiliate of Moody's and part of Moody's ESG solutions. Next slide, please. Next one, thank you. So do companies commit to tackle child labor? So we are assessing companies' ESG performance for more than 5,000 stock listed companies. Based on publicly available information and company feedback, we assess these companies' policies, measures, and key performance indicators on ESG issues. In sectors where we consider it is very material, we analyze companies' commitment to stop child labor. A lot of companies are committing in a generic way to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, but there are only a few sectors where we have identified companies explicitly committing to tackle child labor. And even in these sectors, we see a low percentage of companies with concrete commitments. For example, in industrial goods and services, only 32% of the companies had a formal commitment, while this figure decreases to only 50% for the food sector. When we look to concrete due diligence measures specifically focused on child labor, the figures are even lower, as companies that have implemented these measures are in general tackling in a rather generic way all kinds of human rights issues in the supply chain, but without a specific focus on child labor. Next slide, please, Colleen. So when we look in terms of controversies, what are the most exposed sectors and issues in the supply chain? So in our controversy risk assessment, we are monitoring a universe of 10,000 companies on their involvement in controversies related to child labor. As child labor is for big stock listed companies, mostly a supply chain issue, child labor cases are part of social and human rights issues in the supply chain in our assessment. So cases covered here relate to general human rights issues, forced labor, child labor, decent wages, health and safety, and working hours. And overall, we identified more than 380 controversies linked to social or human rights issues in the supply chain. The three most exposed sectors here were specialized retail, food, and technology hardware. When we look specifically to controversies linked to child labor, we identified more than 100 controversies involving child labor allegations. In a lot of these cases, child labor cases were also linked to forced labor, health and safety issues, and working hours. So overall, it means that 26% of all supply chain controversies were linked to a child labor issue. Next slide, please. So what were the sectors and activities most exposed to these controversies? We see a slightly different picture here with now as the most exposed sector, the food sector, followed by tobacco, luxury goods and cosmetics, technology, hardware, and automobiles. While some years ago, we still had more specialized retail companies involved in child labor related controversies, we see now that they are not anymore in the top 5. So this might be an indication that thanks to huge stakeholder pressure and campaigns of the last years, they've taken more due diligence measures and improved their child labor policies and approach. As regards the type of activities involved, we see a concentration of cases in the palm oil sector, cobalt mining, and the cocoa sector. Last year, we are observing a huge increase in child labor cases linked to cobalt mining. These are linked to the green energy shift, as cobalt is a rare metal needed for batteries in electric cars and other renewable energies. So most child labor controversies are also concentrated in a few countries, such as Indonesia and Malaysia for the palm oil cases, DRC for cobalt cases, and Ivory Coast and Ghana for the cocoa sector. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of child labor controversies go hand in hand with, for example, dangerous working conditions, environmental problems in the case of cobalt mining, and biodiversity issues in the case of palm oil. Next slide, please. So when we have a look how the company react to controversies, in our assessment, we always analyze how companies react concretely to child labor controversies. Then we observe that overall there is a very weak and insufficient response from companies. In more than 43% of cases, companies did not provide any clear response or reaction. But there were anyway a few good examples of companies that are worth mentioning that have implemented remediative measures such as cooperation with the Fair Labor Association, setup of child labor remediation and monitoring systems, sustainable tobacco program, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, Responsible Mica initiative, and some companies that also decided to stop buying cobalt mined by hand in the DRC. Next slide, please. Indeed, to conclude, overall, few companies have strong commitments to tackle child labor in the supply chain. A limited number of them have implemented some due diligence measures, but also these measures are sometimes considered by stakeholders as being still insufficient. There is an increased stakeholder pressure from NGOs, human rights organizations, and government initiatives, such as, for example, the Dutch Child Labour Due Diligence Law and the UK Slavery Act. But also at European level, there is the EU Taxonomy and Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which now requires companies and financial entities to conduct human rights due diligence for any good or service to qualify as sustainable. So in this context, no matter how green a product may appear, its use, such as the use of child labor in supply chains, will render them unsustainable. And as investors need to comply with these regulations, we also see an increased interest of investors in the topic of child labor. And finally, in line with the recent ILO report that was issued today, we also see indeed in our controversy database an increase in the number of child labor controversies identified over the last years, partially linked to increased pressure from stakeholders, but also linked to the increase in certain activities such as cobalt mining, resulting in more child labor cases in sectors that were before less exposed, such as the automobile sector. So this also, for me, stresses again the importance for a just transition to a green economy, as for the moment we see a kind of contradiction whereby the transition to a more green or sustainable society goes hand in hand with an increase in child labor and other human rights abuses in the supply chain. Thank you, Colleen.
Wow, Geordie, thank you. You get an absolute gold medal for going through your slides so efficiently and bringing us back into time. Thank you very much. That was very helpful. If everyone's okay, shall we just have 2 or 3 minutes just for some comments? Are you all right with that? Okay, great. We got 1 or 2 comments that have come in. Just to say the slides are available. If someone can email us on hello@ardea.international.com. Geordie, I wanted to just start with you just to ask a question as a privilege as being the moderator. Can you just highlight the sources that V.E use to identify if, how companies are involved with child labor?
Yeah, sure. So basically our analysts on a daily basis, they are checking Factiva Dow Jones sources, so which basically cover more than 35,000 international press sources. So all kind of media and press is checked in different languages. And on top of that, we also cover and check all the reports of all kind of what we call additional stakeholder sources that are not captured by Factiva or the press. And this is then mainly focused on trade unions, for example, NGOs, environmental organizations, and human rights organizations, which we also then check in detail to find any related controversy.
Thank you, Geordie. That's really helpful to know. There is a question that's come in. The question is, when it comes to procurement, how are you able to target key areas when you need to be open, fair, and transparent, and open it up to any market? Does anyone want to have a go at trying to answer that? No? Nadia? I mean, maybe I
was trying to multitask and type in the answer to the other question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I thought it's an interesting question. When it comes to procurement, how are you able to target key areas when you need to be open, fair, and transparent, and open in the market? I was going to say, I mean, I think that question lends itself to procurement requirements in law and the public sector, and there are specific very specific standards and also processes on how you address that. Ruth, we've written a book on sustainable procurement, which you can look on the website, which will explain some of that a little bit more, but maybe Nadia, you'd like to, if there's anything in relation to that you want to comment on.
No, I agree. I think it's really also about mapping and understanding, and there's so many laws and regulations that are coming up, you know, whether local or international. So it's a constant learning and adapting, but it's also about getting the right product at the right time. So in coffee, when I think about it, you're buying from give or take 40 countries globally, and you need to be alert on all of that. So yes, that's why the mapping of the supply chain is so critical, I think, to understand what your supply chain is all about in the first place.
Thank you. I think I'm going to call a stop. There is a comment about tips for small and medium companies starting the ambitious journey. As a last point, does anyone want to just throw in what a tip would be to get started on their journey?
I'm happy to take that. And I think, yeah, Joachim, very good question. And one tip would be, so within Alliance 8.7, there is a network for small and medium companies to tackle forced labor. So that might be one, of course, not jumping on child labor. But also within Alliance 8.7, there's, you know, if you join that community, there's lots of resources being shared. That's one thing. I would say when you're a small and medium company, you want to have some level of understanding of your supply chain, and you don't have, you know, time to go there all the time or possibility now. You know, I think certification, of course, is one first step that you can take to have a better risk management of these critical issues, and at the same time also improve the situation of those farmers that you collaborate with. And then you can also learn more by joining other different sector groups that are active in those different tropical commodities.
Yeah, and I think also related to that is really just, you know, setting out what you actually even have in place, and going back to that point about a commitment, because a lot of this is about culture. It doesn't matter if you're small or medium or large. The critical issue is that as a culture, the business is having a commitment to creating change. Right, I think we should stop. It's 20 to 2, and I just want to say thank you again to our speakers. I found myself making a load of notes, really insightful. Thank you for your time. Thank you to all of you as participants who've come in, and sorry that we've run over. And I wish you all a really good day and a good week. So thank you, and bye everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.